Late in the morning on May 8, 1942, Stanley, Swede, Vejtasa leaned into the controls of his Dauntless, staring down at the empty blue stretching endlessly beneath him. At 27 years old, exhaustion weighed on his shoulders, but the war in the sky did not slow for tired men. His aircraft was built to dive, not to chase or duel, yet fate was pushing it into a fighter's role. Far below, the carrier Yorktown twisted through dangerous waters, its white wake curling behind it like a warning sign. Every sailor on deck believed the enemy's torpedoes were already cutting through the sea toward them. Radios hissed with broken messages, clipped orders, and voices shaking with strain. Fear filled the air thicker than fuel smoke. This was Coral Sea war reinvented. The fleets never saw one another. No guns fired ship to ship. Instead, young men flew across endless miles of ocean to fight enemies they might never even glimpse. And the Americans were losing more than machines. Crews were disappearing into fire and water. With every passing minute, the sky demanded another life in return. Vejtasa glanced across his instruments. The big cyclone engine growled like an angry animal, its vibrations traveling through the metal skin of the aircraft and into his bones. The Dauntless was never admired for beauty. Pilots didn't use its official name. They gave it rougher titles: Barge, Clunker, and, with bitter jokes, Slow but Deadly. It flew like a cargo wagon that had somehow wandered into the sky. The plane's job was simple and brutal. Carry a massive bomb high above the sea, roll over, and dive almost straight down until the enemy filled the glass in front of the pilot. It was designed for savage downward attacks, not graceful flying. It was bulky, sluggish, and stubborn in the air. Next to a fighter, it felt less like a bird and more like a falling crate. But the danger wasn't his own aircraft. The real nightmare was what hunted him. For months, briefings had warned American pilots about the Japanese Zero. It wasn't just a fighter, it was a legend. Faster than anything the U.S. Navy could field. Able to climb like it was being pulled by invisible hands. Able to turn so sharply, it seemed to bend the rules of physics. The Zero had no armor to protect its pilot, no fuel tanks that could seal themselves when hit. It survived by never being touched. Light, fragile, and deadly, it was like a razor blade in the sky. Try to turn with it, you were finished. Try to outclimb it, you were finished. Navy pilots were taught one rule above all others. If you met a Zero, you ran. And if you couldn't run, then the fight was already over. That morning, the carrier Yorktown was being stretched thinner than it had ever been before. Its fighter squadrons, the squat, rugged wildcats built to shield the fleet, were scattered across the sky, tied up escorting American bombers or racing toward distant threats. There were not enough of them to cover everything, not enough to guard every angle. For long, dangerous minutes, the great carrier moved through hostile waters with almost no shield at all. Down in the radar room, operators began to see strange shapes forming on their glowing screens. At first they looked like ghosts, faint echoes that barely seemed real. Then the echoes grew clearer. A massive Japanese strike was coming, launched from the carrier Shikaku. It carried torpedo planes meant to rip ships open. It carried dive bombers meant to turn steel into fire. And wrapped around them were Japan's best pilots, flying the Zeros that had already made the Pacific a graveyard. Commander Joe Taylor studied his board and felt the truth settle in. He checked again, hoping he had missed something. He hadn't. There were no fighters left to send. Not one. The only aircraft still ready were dive bombers, so he made a decision that sounded like madness. He ordered Vejtasa and a handful of Dauntless crews into the air as an anti-torpedo patrol. It was an order born from desperation. You don't send heavy trucks to chase race cars. You don't send bombers to fight fighters. But sometimes you send what you have and pray. Vejtasa didn't argue. He followed orders like a professional. But inside him lived another pilot, the man he had been before the war. He had trained as a fighter. He understood the hidden math of air combat, speed, angles, altitude, timing. He knew how life could be decided in less than a second. When he was moved into a bomber squadron, he accepted it, but he never forgot what he had learned. When he looked at the Dauntless, he didn't just see weight and slowness. He saw possibilities others ignored. One of those possibilities lay in the dive brakes. Huge steel panels, punched full of holes, ran along the wings. When deployed, they split, one part snapping upward, the other downward, slamming the plane into a wall of air. They were meant to keep the aircraft from tearing itself apart during near-vertical dives. Most pilots saw them as simple tools. Vejtasa saw them as a trick, a surprise, a way to bend the rules of a fight he was not supposed to win. Behind him, Radioman Third Class Frank Wood checked his twin machine guns again and again. He trusted Vejtasa because there was no other choice. His job was to guard the rear, to shout warnings, to fire when death appeared from behind. His guns were not killers. They were meant to scare, to distract, to buy seconds. Against the Zero's cannons, they were toys. If a Zero ever lined up perfectly behind them, Wood would be the last thin line between life and fire. Ahead, the sky was broken by low, scattered clouds, great white islands floating over a dark sea. They were beautiful and they were deadly. Fighters could hide inside them and appear wherever they wished. Vejtasa checked his front guns. 2 heavy machine guns mounted in the nose. They were meant for ships and ground targets, not for dogfights. The system that kept them from hitting the propeller often made them fire unevenly, but each bullet could tear through metal and shatter engines. Then the radio spoke, flat and calm like a man reading the weather. "Bandits, 10 o'clock high." Vejtasa searched the sky. At first he saw nothing. Then a sparkle like silver dust thrown against blue. The dust shaped itself into wings. The wings became fighters, Zeros, many of them. They flew high, weaving slowly, waiting like hunters who already knew the kill was coming. Vejtasa felt anger rise, hot and sharp. Anger at being sent up in a slow machine. Anger at months of retreat. Anger at being told what could not be done. He pressed the radio switch. Tally-ho! He broke away from the others. The remaining Dauntless planes stayed on their patrol line, still searching for torpedo bombers. Vejtasa didn't. He turned straight toward the fighters, alone. One heavy bomber turning into a sky full of enemy aces. It was madness. The Japanese pilots must have thought it a joke, a mistake, or a suicide. 3 Zeros peeled away from the group and rolled into a dive. The lead pilot flew like someone who had done this many times before, smooth and controlled. He slid in behind Vejtasa, closing fast. The Zero screamed forward. The Dauntless crawled by comparison. The distance between them vanished. Wood shouted from the back, 6 o'clock, they're on us. Vejtasa didn't turn his head. He watched only his speed and his instruments. He waited. He needed the enemy to believe the kill was certain. He needed him to come closer, to commit. The Zero closed in, far, then near, then terrifyingly close. Vejtasa could almost feel the other pilot's finger tightening. He could imagine the crosshairs sliding over his fuselage. This was the instant where most men disappeared in fire. Vejtasa did nothing until the last possible moment. Then he reached down, seized the dive brake lever, and tore it back with every ounce of strength in his arm. The effect was instantaneous, brutal, and utterly unforgiving. The moment Vejtasa yanked that lever back, the hydraulic actuators screamed like tortured steel, and the massive, perforated dive flaps sprang open into the rushing slipstream. The SBD didn't simply slow down. It slammed headlong into an invisible wall of air. The deceleration was so violent it slammed Vejtasa forward against his shoulder straps, his harness biting into him like steel jaws. It was the sensation of driving a heavy car at full speed into a sandbank. Sudden, merciless, unrelenting. The airspeed indicator plummeted as if gravity itself had pulled it down. One heartbeat, the Dauntless was cruising at 160 knots. The next, it hovered in the sky like a 10,000-pound kite caught in a windstorm, suspended only by sheer drag and stubborn physics. The right cyclone engine roared in protest, the propeller clawing at empty air, but the plane refused to move forward, hanging stubbornly in defiance. The Japanese pilot in the lead Zero never had a chance to react. He was a predator, honed by hundreds of hours in combat, a hunter conditioned to anticipate every move. His mind had already plotted the intercept, a perfect collision of angles and speeds based on textbook physics. But Vejtasa had just thrown the rulebook out the window. The Zero came screaming in at 300 miles per hour, closing with lethal precision, and then froze in disbelief. The target wasn't where it should have been. 50 yards closer than expected, the Dauntless hung in the air like a ghost, defying logic. The Zero pilot yanked back instinctively, trying to avoid an impact that should not have existed, but physics was no ally to him now. He didn't have time to adjust. He didn't have time to fire. He streaked past Vejtasa's left wing so close that the rivets on the Zero's engine cowling were etched in the pilot's vision. The hunter had overshot the prey and the moment of reckoning had arrived. Vejtasa didn't hesitate. He slammed the dive brake lever forward. The flaps snapped shut like steel jaws closing. Drag vanished in an instant. He shoved the throttle to the firewall, and the right cyclone roared, unleashing 1,000 furious horses into the propeller. Freed from its invisible anchor, the SBD surged forward. Vejtasa stomped the left rudder and wrenched the stick over. The Dauntless pivoted on its wingtip, heavy, cumbersome, and unforgiving, a muscled, violent snap turn. It wasn't elegant like a Zero. It was raw power, ugly and effective. In mere seconds, Vejtasa had gone from hunted to hunter. The Zero pilot was now directly ahead, trying to pull up, loop around, and strike again. He had made the fatal mistake of assuming the SBD was helpless. In exposing his belly, he had signed his fate. Vejtasa lined up the nose. The iron sights centered on the white fuselage of the Mitsubishi. He squeezed the trigger. The 50 caliber Browning machine guns in the nose began to hammer relentlessly. Thump, 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 thump. Slow compared to the Japanese guns, but powerful, rhythmic, a relentless chug that rattled the cockpit floor. Speed wasn't the point. Weight was. Punch, force, destruction. The rounds tore across the space between the planes in a heartbeat. They didn't sparkle, they didn't glance off. They smashed. The first burst hit the wing root, ripping through aluminum like a chainsaw through balsa wood. The main spar shredded, the fuel tank ignited. The Zero didn't just smoke, it disintegrated. The wing snapped upward, torn off violently. The fuselage spun like a top in a lethal spin, fire erupting from where the pilot had sat. Wreckage tumbled toward the ocean, a fiery testament that the so-called barge had teeth. Frank Wood, peering backward, watched the Zero vanish into flames and debris. He screamed into the intercom, a mix of terror and ecstatic joy. You got him, skipper. He's burning." But there was no time for celebration. The remaining 2 Zeros were still in the sky. They had watched their leader turn into a cloud of aluminum shrapnel. Confusion rippled through their ranks. This wasn't in the manual. American bombers were supposed to fly straight, die in formation, and make it easy. They weren't supposed to hang in the sky and fight back. The 2 remaining Zeros split apart. They climbed, using superior power-to-weight ratios to gain height, planning to dive on the Dauntless from 2 angles, aiming to tear him apart like wolves circling a bear. It was a brilliant tactic. Against most pilots, it would have worked. But Vejtasa knew the SBD's secret. Down low, at 2,000 feet in dense, heavy air, the Dauntless had grip, energy, and momentum on its side. The Zero could dance at 15,000 feet, but down here, it bled speed with every aggressive maneuver. The second Zero dove steeply from the right. Vejtasa studied it carefully. He needed the pilot to commit fully, to force himself into a high-speed dive where control surfaces stiffened and precision faltered. Tracers, angry red streaks, zipped past the canopy. Only then did Vejtasa pull the SBD into a tight climbing turn, meeting the attack with a classic scissors maneuver, an air fighter tactic, flown in a plane that looked like it delivered milk. The Zero couldn't follow. It shuddered, slipped, and overshot. As it tried to climb back, it leveled out too long. Vejtasa didn't hesitate. He reversed his turn, heavy rudder, stick hard over, G-forces bending the plane and pilot alike. The nose swung around, presenting a perfect non-deflection shot. Vejtasa fired. The tracers stitched a line of holes from tail to cockpit. The Zero shuddered, stalled, fell on one wing, trailing smoke. It didn't explode, but it was done. 2 down. In under 3 minutes, a single dive bomber had destroyed 2 of the Navy's most feared opponents. But the fight was far from over. The sky above Yorktown was a chaos of contrails, smoke, and aircraft. Every Japanese pilot in the sector saw the lone SBD and moved to attack. It was like kicking a hornet's nest. Frank Wood's twin 30s chattered without pause. He wasn't aiming precisely anymore. He was painting the sky with lead. A Zero would dive from behind, aiming for the kill, only to be repelled by a stream of bullets. Hot brass bounced around Vejtasa's feet. The cockpit stank of cordite, sharp and acrid, tasting like metal at the back of the throat. "Skipper, 3 more at 7 o'clock, 2 more at 4. They're lining up." Vejtasa scanned rapidly. The situation had escalated from a patrol to a full squadron engagement. The Japanese had realized this wasn't just a slow bomber. They were facing a menace, and they coordinated, trying to box him in. They wanted him dead, offended by his existence. He checked his ammo, half spent. He couldn't spray and pray, he had to be precise. Fuel was fine. The right cyclone drank it fast, but enough remained. The real problem was numbers. He couldn't repeat the airbrake trick forever. Eventually, someone would sit back and rake him with cannons. So he changed the battlefield. Vejtasa pushed the nose down, dropping to 50 feet above the waves, deck level. Flying this low denied the Zeros the advantage of diving from below. They had to attack from above, worrying about pulling out before hitting the ocean. The planet became his shield. A third Zero charged head-on, the ultimate game of chicken. 2 planes hurtling toward each other at over 500 miles per hour. First to flinch loses. Bombers didn't usually play this game, but Vejtasa did. He gritted his teeth, held steady, and squeezed the trigger. The Zero's 20mm cannons lit the water behind him with explosions. He aimed true. His 50 caliber round slammed into the engine. For a heartbeat, the radial engine resisted, then catastrophically failed. The Japanese pilot yanked up, windshield coated with oil. He missed by inches, the prop wash rocking the SBD. Vejtasa fought the controls, keeping the wings from dipping into the sea. He looked back. The Zero cartwheeled across the surface, caught a wave, flipped end over end, and vanished into foam. 3. No time to breathe. The radio screamed, "Bandits, many bandits." Swarming the torpedo planes. Black dots darkened the horizon, dozens of them. Most pilots would have turned back, landed, claimed their kills, had a drink. Vejtasa was no ordinary pilot. Adrenaline replaced blood. Survival logic had been replaced by pure, unrelenting combat instinct. He banked low, wingtip brushing the waves, and dove back into the swarm. "Frank," he said, calm, terrifyingly calm over the intercom. "Reload those 30s. We're not done yet." Frank Wood, sweat dripping, blistered hands slapping ammunition cans into the receivers, racked the charging handles. "Ready, skipper." Vejtasa shoved the throttle past the stop into emergency power. The engine screamed. The Dauntless, the Barge, the Clunk, the delivery truck surged upward. It climbed to meet 40 Japanese aircraft, and Swede Vejtasa was going to fight them all. Vejtasa climbed back into the maelstrom, the air above the American fleet a roiling, chaotic storm of steel, smoke, and fire. The sky had become a furball, a 3-dimensional battlefield where up and down no longer mattered, where every movement could mean life or death. The Japanese strike force was tightening their formation, lining up for torpedo runs against the Yorktown, and the heavens were filled with the sleek, deadly silhouettes of Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, their wings glinting in the sun. Protecting them was a fresh wave of Mitsubishi Zeros, elite fighters tasked with sweeping the skies clean. They saw the lone SBD climbing from the deck, smoke trailing from its belly, and for a moment, Even hardened Japanese pilots blinked. It was like watching a wounded bear charge back into a pack of wolves, defying logic, defying nature, defying everything they had been trained to expect. The Zeros came at him in pairs, sharper and more calculated than before. They had learned from their earlier mistake. This time, they didn't rush in reckless. They coordinated, moving with precision born of training and experience, aiming to overwhelm with speed and numbers. They attempted the classic boom and zoom maneuver. Climb high, dive with fury, slash with their 20mm cannons, then retreat to altitude where the lumbering SBD couldn't follow. But Vejtasa refused to play by their rules. Every time a Zero dove, expecting the SBD to veer away like a frightened prey, Vejtasa met it head-on. He turned the weight of the Dauntless into a weapon. Pulling the stick back, the heavy bomber carved through the air with unstoppable momentum, a freight train on a tight curve. Each movement forced the Japanese pilots to constantly adjust, their carefully calculated deflection shots ruined. They sprayed the sky with tracer fire, but none found its mark. One Zero, frustrated and overzealous, dove too low, edging dangerously close, then attempted a sharp pull-out directly in front of Vejtasa's nose. A fatal miscalculation. The Japanese pilot assumed he had space, but he underestimated the SBD's lunge. Vejtasa slammed the throttle and mixture control forward. The right cyclone engine roared like a beast, the Dauntless surged with fury. He didn't even aim through the sight. He walked the tracers from his cowling guns straight into the cockpit of the Zero. Glass shattered. The plane pitched violently, rolled over and plummeted into the ocean. That was number 4. In the space of moments, Vejtasa had achieved ace status. Though no one was keeping score, they were only fighting to survive the next 10 seconds. Inside the cockpit, the noise was deafening. Not just the engine, but the war tearing through the plane itself. Japanese bullets found the fuselage, hammering the metal like 1,000 tin hammers striking in unison. Ping, whack, thud. Vejtasa felt each impact reverberate through his seat. A 7.7mm round smashed the instrument panel, glass spraying across the altimeter. Another round tore through the floorboard, grazing his leg by inches. The SBD was built like a tank, reinforced with trusses and heavy bulkheads, but even tanks have limits. The controls were beginning to soften, stretching under strain, teasing collapse. In the back, Frank Wood waged his own battle. His twin .30 caliber machine guns were red hot, the barrels glowing dull cherry red from continuous fire. He had burned through his ready ammo cans and was rifling through the reserves, kicking aside empty casings. A Zero slid into the saddle, 6 o'clock low, a lethal spot where the tail would normally shield the bomber. The Japanese pilot thought himself safe, stabilizing for a shot meant to drive a shell straight into the SBD's guts. Vejtasa sensed the shadow before he saw it. He slammed the rudder pedal to the floor. The SBD skidded sideways, crabbing through the air like a drift car on a wet track, throwing the Zero into Wood's firing line. Wood didn't hesitate. He hammered the triggers, sending a torrent of .30 caliber rounds into the enemy. Smoke erupted immediately, thick black oil coating the Zero's windshield. Blinded, the pilot jerked the stick back, the plane stalling, spinning away from the fight. "I got him, I scratched him, he's going down," Wood screamed into the intercom, voice cracking with adrenaline and relief. But time was slipping away. More enemies crowded the sky. Vejtasa's forward guns clicked dry. The 50s were empty. He was defenseless ahead. Wood was down to his last belt. The sky was still teeming with foes. 3 Zeros circled, predators sizing up a wounded, smoking, limping SBD like vultures. They could see the American plane was hurt. They could smell victory. They lined up abreast, a 3-plane firing squad, eyes locked on a single target. They dove in, shallow, conserving ammo, confident in their kill. The SBD appeared finished. Vejtasa turned toward them. It was madness. A defenseless bomber, wounded, limping, and low on ammo, pointing its propeller hub at 3 skilled fighters. He wasn't trying to shoot. He was bluffing with raw, terrifying aggression. He was betting that their instinct to survive outweighed their Bushido discipline. 600 miles per hour closing speed. In an instant, the Japanese leader saw the SBD grow in his windscreen. Ugly, massive, unstoppable. The American wasn't turning, wasn't flinching, was coming straight at him. At the last second, instinct shattered training. The leader yanked right. His wingman veered left. They scattered, abandoning the attack. The wall of fire they had planned never came. The slipstreams rocked the SBD like a small boat in a hurricane. Vejtasa let out a jagged, hysterical laugh. He had won the psychological war. He dove for sanctuary, a thick bank of cumulus clouds 1,000 feet below. Nose over, urging the battered Dauntless into speed, he felt a final Zero's frustrated pursuit. Cannon shells detonated around the wings, shrapnel pinging against the skin. He ignored it, punching into the clouds. The gray mist swallowed the violence, the tracers, the noise, the chaos, replacing it with damp, muffled silence. Inside the cloud, he leveled out, checking gauges, oil pressure dropping, cylinder head temperature redlining, hydraulic system shot. He was flying a wreck, but he was flying. "Frank, you okay back there?" he asked over the intercom. A long, terrifying pause, then a crackle of static. "I'm here, Skipper," Wood said, small, exhausted. "Out of ammo, out of everything, but I'm here." Vejtasa exhaled, a breath held far too long. He banked gently, feeling the vibrations, testing each wing. The SBD shuddered, but it held. They had flown a delivery truck into a Formula One race, wrecked the track, and walked away. The battle raged on. The Yorktown was still under attack. Radio calls screamed of torpedo hits and burning ships, but Vejtasa and Wood had done their part. They had faced the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy and broken its nose. The Zero wasn't invincible, it was just a machine, and machines could be broken if you got close enough. Vejtasa set a course for the fleet. He didn't know if the carrier floated. He didn't know if a landing deck awaited. He didn't care. He just wanted to get this crate down before it fell apart. He patted the dashboard, whispering, "Good girl. You ugly, beautiful bucket of bolts. Good girl." The flight back to the USS Yorktown was agony measured in 20 minutes. Time stretched, each second a slow drip of exhaustion and tension. Adrenaline, which had fueled every nerve and sinew through the chaos of battle, was fading, leaving a crash in its wake. His hands trembled first, the shaking creeping down his arms to his knees. It wasn't fear. It was the body's rebellion after half an hour of pure, primal fight or flight. Every muscle was demanding rest. The cockpit was frigid. Wind whistled through the jagged holes in the canopy, a high-pitched scream that wouldn't quit, cutting through his thoughts. Every time the SBD hit a pocket of turbulence, the airframe groaned, metal whining like a bag of silverware tossed down a staircase. Vejtasa didn't know how much of the wing structure remained intact. He didn't know if the tail was held together by bolts or sheer habit. Through a break in the clouds, he spotted the task force. The Yorktown was a tiny gray splinter in a vast ocean of blue. She was turning into the wind, recovering aircraft. Fuel was critical. The needle danced perilously on the empty mark. There was no room for a second pass. One attempt, one chance. And in a plane riddled with bullet holes, a miss meant a 4-second swim into the Pacific. He dropped the landing gear handle, holding his breath as he waited for the telltale thunk. 2 thunks. The green lights blinked on. The gear was down. The SBD, battered but unbowed, was refusing to quit. Vejtasa lined up on the groove. On the deck, the landing signal officer waved his paddles, assessing the wreckage. Smoke trailed from the cowl, jagged tears marred the aluminum, and the plane's battered form seemed barely airworthy. Still, he gave the cut signal. Vejtasa chopped the throttle. The SBD fell out of the sky, smashing onto the flight deck in a controlled crash. The tail hook snagged the number 3 wire, yanking the 10,000-pound plane to a halt. Propeller windmilled to a stop. Silence followed, a weight heavier than the chaos of battle. For long moments, the deck crew didn't move. They had seen damaged planes before, holes in wings, scorched fuselages, but nothing like this. The SBD looked chewed by a steel shark, fuselage full of holes, rudder reduced to shreds of fabric flapping in the wind, cowling black with oil and soot. Vejtasa slid the canopy back, unbuckled, tried to stand, and his legs betrayed him. He grabbed the windscreen frame, climbed onto the wing, then down to the deck. Frank Wood emerged from the back, soot-streaked and wide-eyed, face pale as a raccoon's mask. Commander Taylor met them, silent. No questions, the plane told the story. The crew chief circled bullet holes with chalk. He stopped at 30, then 50. He shook his head. "Skipper," he said, wiping grease from his hands, "I don't know how the hell you flew this thing home. Half the control cables are hanging by a thread." Vejtasa lit a cigarette, hands finally steady. "She flies fine," he said, voice calm. "She just pulls a little to the left." The debriefing room was thick with smoke and tension. Intelligence officers tried to unravel the chaos of the Coral Sea. Both sides claimed victory. Both lied about losses. When Vejtasa walked in and filed his report, silence fell. 3 Zeros destroyed, a 4th driven off. They looked at him like he'd lost his mind. SBD pilots didn't shoot down Zeros, they survived them if they were lucky. To claim 3 kills in a single sortie was impossible, ludicrous, a tall tale of ego. Then the evidence came. Gun camera footage. Eyewitness accounts from other pilots who had seen the lone SBD dive into the swarm. Skepticism evaporated. The impossible became fact. The Navy brass realized 2 truths. The Zero wasn't invincible, and they were wasting Swede Vejtasa in a bomber. A man who flew a lumbering dive bomber like a fighter shouldn't be driving a dump truck. He should be in a race car. Vejtasa was awarded the Navy Cross, but the real reward was the transfer. Out of dive bombers into fighters where he belonged. He joined VF-10, the Grim Reapers, flying the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, faster, tougher, 450 caliber guns. For Vejtasa, it was a scalpel replacing a sledgehammer. He didn't just join the squadron, he taught them. He taught the philosophy he had learned in the SBD. Use what you have, ignore the experts, fight the plane, not the specs. 5 months later, in October 1942 at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, Coral Sea was no fluke. Vejtasa led a division of Wildcats against a massive wave of Japanese torpedo bombers. In a single sortie, he shot down 7 enemy planes. 7, in one flight. He cut through their formation like a scythe. Aggressive, nose-to-nose tactics honed in the SBD, now deadly in a fighter. The Barge pilot had become the Pacific's deadliest. But the legend always circled back to May 8, 1942 and the SBD Dauntless. History loves the P-51 Mustang, the Spitfire. Sleek, sexy fighters fit for posters. But the SBD Dauntless is the blue-collar hero. It did the dirty work, sank Japanese carriers at Midway, pounded islands. And in the hands of one stubborn pilot, it dogfought the finest interceptors in the world and won. Vejtasa survived the war, stayed in the Navy, transitioned to jets, rose through the ranks and retired as a captain. He lived quietly, passing away in 1999 at 84. Ask him about the Coral Sea and he would shrug. He didn't dwell on terror, math, or the Swiss cheese breaks. He spoke of necessity. We had a job to do, and we didn't have any other planes, so we used the ones we had. It's simple, but it hides a profound truth. Experts will always tell you why you can't win. They'll quote specs, drag coefficients, turn rates, and physics. They'll say you're too slow, too heavy, too obsolete. They'll tell you to run. Swede Vejtasa didn't listen. He didn't listen to the math. He listened to the engine. He listened to the fight. On May 8, 1942, he took a machine the world called garbage and turned it into a weapon of war. The most dangerous component of any aircraft isn't the engine, or the guns, or the wings. It's the pilot. It's the refusal to accept defeat. It's the willingness to throw the manual out the window, yank the brake lever, and turn a delivery truck into legend. We tell these stories not just for dates or maps. We tell them to remember spirit, to rescue moments from the archives before men like Swede, Vejtasa, and Frank would vanish into silence. As long as we remember the day the SBD fought the Zeros, we remember that impossible odds are just opinion. Sometimes survival demands doing what everyone calls suicide. You don't run, you turn, you fight. Thanks for watching. If you want more stories about pilots who broke the rules and won the war, hit like and subscribe. And tell us in the comments, would you have pulled the brakes or tried to run? We'll see you in the next one.